I just found out the disgusting reason my nurse intentionally harmed my wife when she went into labor. I first noticed it 5 minutes in, when she gave her medicine that specifically made her contractions more painful. Within minutes, my wife was crying. "Something's wrong," I begged the nurse. But Renee responded that this was standard procedure. She patted my wife's leg, then put on a new glove, and told us she needed to check how dilated my wife was. She put her hand inside, and when she pulled it out, her glove was covered in blood and some sort of matter. Not only that, but my wife was now screaming in a way I'd never heard before. That's when Renee turned my attention to the baby's heart rate monitor. It was dropping. "We need to perform an emergency C-section for the baby's safety," she said. Before I knew it, she was wheeling in medical equipment and throwing out medical jargon that made it sound like my wife would die without this. I couldn't even protest as she rushed Abigail away. I begged to at least be let into the operating room, but was told no. The doors swung shut in my face as my wife's hand reached for mine. 20 minutes later, a doctor I'd never seen before found me in the hallway. "I'm sorry, your daughter didn't make it." I dropped to my knees. "When can I see her just to hold her?" I asked through tears. "She's being prepared," the accompanying nurse said. "Give us some time." I waited 6 hours while they prepared her. Finally, they wheeled out a small bassinet. When I pulled back the blanket, my stomach dropped. The baby's nose was wrong. The chin was different from every ultrasound we'd had. This was not our baby. When Abigail finally woke up from surgery and she was shown our dead baby, she had the same reaction as me. "That's not our baby." The nurses exchanged glances. One of them sat down beside Abigail's bed. "Honey, I know this is hard. Grief makes us see things differently. This is your baby." Abigail became frantic, trying to get out of bed despite the fresh C-section incision. "You don't understand. This isn't her." That's when they pulled out a needle to sedate my wife again, claiming trauma-induced psychotic break. By the time I could grab the nurse's arm to stop her, the needle was already in. When she woke up again, calmer but still insisting, they brought in a psychiatrist. Dr. Morrison didn't even examine the baby. He just nodded while taking notes about our shared delusion. He prescribed antipsychotics for Abigail and suggested I might benefit from therapy too. We demanded genetic testing. The head nurse Barbara rolled her eyes at me. "Sir, you need to accept your loss. We've been doing this for 30 years. Babies' features can appear different due to swelling." When I insisted, she said we'd need authorization forms, psychiatric evaluations, to prove we were mentally competent to make that request. The hospital can't just run expensive tests because grieving parents are in denial. I tried going over her head. The department director gave me 10 minutes between surgeries. He didn't even look at the photos from our ultrasounds when I tried to show him. "I understand you're going through something unimaginable, but our staff are professionals. These conspiracy theories are a normal part of grief." He recommended a support group for parents who'd lost children during delivery. The hospital administrator, Mr. Granlock, was worse. When I finally got a meeting after camping outside his office for 3 days, he had security on standby. "Sir, your behavior is escalating. You're harassing our staff, making wild accusations. I sympathize with your loss, but if this continues, I'll have to ban you from the premises." He slid a paper across his desk. "This is a formal warning. One more incident, and will involve law enforcement." The billing department had processed a $75,000 administrative adjustment the day after our daughter died. When I questioned it, they said it was standard for complicated deliveries. That was when I couldn't take it anymore. I found the hospital's internal directory and started calling every nurse who'd worked in maternity. Most hung up immediately, but one, a younger nurse named Kelly, agreed to meet me at a coffee shop. She was terrified, kept looking over her shoulder. "I can't say much," she whispered, "but check the adoption paperwork filed the morning after your daughter was born. Renee has signing privileges." She left before I could ask more. I went to the courthouse and searched public adoption records. There it was, a private adoption finalized the day after our daughter died. The birth mother's signature was illegible, but the notary was Renee. The adoptive parents had paid $75,000 in medical expenses to the hospital, our exact billing adjustment. I photocopied everything and drove straight back to the hospital. That's when security intercepted me at the entrance. "Mr. Granlock wants to see you in his office." "Now, Mr. and Mrs., I need you to understand something. Renee is our best labor and delivery nurse. 15 years here, countless successful deliveries. These accusations are becoming slander." He leaned forward. "I've consulted with our legal team. If you continue, we'll have to consider your mental fitness. The state takes threats against medical professionals seriously. I could have you both placed on psychiatric holds." He pushed another paper forward. "Or you can sign this. It acknowledges that your daughter passed away due to complications during birth, that you've been given appropriate support, and that you won't pursue any action against this hospital or its staff." At the bottom was a number, $50,000. "To help with funeral expenses and counseling," he said. I looked at that paper for what felt like forever, maybe 30 seconds, watching the number at the bottom blur and refocus while my hands stayed completely still on the desk, not shaking like they had 3 days ago when I first held that baby that wasn't mine. I pushed the paper back across his desk without signing it. Granlock's whole face changed, went hard like stone, and he picked up his phone right away, pressed a button, and said security needed to come to his office immediately. 2 guards showed up in less than a minute, big guys in blue uniforms who stood behind my chair while Granlock told them them I was banned from all hospital property starting right now, and if I came back, they should call the police. They walked me out through the main lobby, one on each side, past all the people waiting with their sick kids and broken bones, and I could feel everyone watching us like I was some kind of criminal. Outside in the parking lot, still walking between the guards, I pulled out my phone and texted Abigail that we needed to find a lawyer today, not tomorrow, today, because this was getting worse fast. She texted back that she was still foggy from the pills they made her take, but she understood we couldn't do this alone anymore. The guards stood there watching while I got in my car, and they didn't move until I drove off the property. That evening, we sat in the office of Zara Sharpgrove, a medical malpractice attorney whose secretary had squeezed us in at the last minute after I explained our situation on the phone. Zara listened to our whole story without interrupting once, just taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and when we finished, she asked to see everything we had, especially the adoption paperwork I'd found at the courthouse and the billing adjustment from the hospital. I spread all the papers across her desk, the adoption records, the billing statements, even the photos from our ultrasounds that showed our baby's face clearly. She studied each document carefully, taking pictures with her phone, then told us she'd send preservation letters to the hospital first thing tomorrow morning, demanding they keep all records related to our daughter's birth and death. She warned us this would make things escalate, that the hospital would probably get their lawyers involved right away, but we needed to protect any evidence before it disappeared. The next morning, I drove to the police station to file a report about what I believed was baby theft, but the desk officer barely looked up from his computer when I started explaining. He said without actual proof that a crime happened, not just suspicions and coincidences, this was a civil matter between us and the hospital, and I should talk to my lawyer about it. I tried showing him the adoption paperwork, but he said adoptions happen all the time, and that didn't prove anything illegal occurred. Later that day, I went to the county clerk's office where Na Sharpcreek, one of the senior clerks, explained that getting adoption records unsealed required a court order, and I'd need to show good cause, which meant more than just thinking something suspicious happened. She couldn't help me directly with our case, but suggested I should look for patterns in other adoption filings from the same time period, maybe find other families with similar stories. I spent the whole afternoon at the courthouse going through public adoption records for babies born at our hospital in the past year, writing down every detail I could find. 3 other adoptions were finalized within days of the babies being born, all with complicated delivery stories in the records, and all of them had Renee's signature as the notary on the paperwork. My phone rang while I was still at the courthouse, and it was Mustafa Smoothridge, the investigative reporter from the local paper who I'd left 5 messages for over the past 2 days. He said my story sounded interesting, and he wanted to know more, but his editor wouldn't let him run anything this serious without more proof, maybe other families willing to go on record or some kind of documentation showing a pattern. I told him about the 3 other adoptions I'd just found, and he said to send him everything I had, and he'd do some digging on his end. That night at home, Abigail sat on the couch staring at nothing, her eyes unfocused from the psychiatric medications they'd prescribed, the ones that were supposed to help her accept our loss, but really just made her feel like she was underwater all the time. I wonder what's really happening with those 3 other adoptions having Renee's signature. That pattern seems too neat to be random chance. The way they rushed Abigail to surgery and then took 6 hours to prepare the baby makes me curious about what they were actually doing during all that time. We got into an argument about whether she should keep taking them because I thought they were making her worse, but she was scared that if she stopped, the hospital would use it against us, say she was unstable and dangerous. She kept saying they had all the power, they had the lawyers, they had the doctors who would testify that we were just grieving parents in denial, and maybe they were right. Maybe we were crazy to think our baby was still alive somewhere. I held her while she cried, both of us sitting there in our living room surrounded by baby stuff we'd bought, the crib still in boxes against the wall, the tiny clothes still in shopping bags, everything waiting for a baby who according to the hospital was dead, but who we both knew in our bones was out there somewhere with strangers who'd paid $75,000 for her. The next morning, I drove to the state health department building downtown while Abigail stayed home, too weak from surgery to come with me. The clerk at the records office barely looked up from her computer when I asked for a Freedom of Information Act request form. She slid the papers across the counter and told me it could take weeks for any response about complaints against the hospital's maternity ward. I filled out every line, making copies of everything before handing it back. That night, I spread all our daughter's medical records across the kitchen table, going through each page with a highlighter. Something caught my eye on the 3rd page. The official time of death was listed as 2:47 a.m., exactly 20 minutes after Renee had wheeled Abigail into surgery at 2:27 a.m. But the doctor had found me in the hallway at 2:47 a.m. to tell me our daughter was dead. The times didn't add up. How could he tell me she was dead at the exact moment she supposedly died in the operating room? I circled the times in red marker and took photos with my phone. The next day, a certified letter arrived from the hospital's legal department. The thick envelope contained a no trespass order signed by a judge, threatening criminal charges if I set foot on the hospital property. I called called Zara immediately, and she came over to review it. She said this was intimidation, but we needed to respect it for now while building our case. 3 days later, I found myself sitting in a circle of folding chairs in a church basement, listening to other parents talk about losing their babies during delivery. When my turn came, I kept my story vague, but asked if anyone else had gotten strange bills afterward. A woman across from me nodded slowly, mentioning a $50,000 adjustment she never understood. An older man said they'd gotten an $80,000 one. After the meeting, I caught up with both couples in the parking lot. The older couple walked away fast when I started explaining our suspicions, but the younger couple, both barely 20, stayed to listen. They pulled out their phone and showed me their billing statement with a $70,000 adjustment, dated the day after their son supposedly died. We exchanged numbers, and they promised to send me copies of everything. I tried calling Kelly's cell phone again that afternoon, but it went straight to voicemail. Her texts weren't delivering either, showing only gray instead of blue. I drove to her apartment complex that evening and saw a moving truck parked outside her building. Her name had been peeled off the mailbox, leaving just sticky residue behind. The neighbor loading groceries said she'd moved out suddenly 2 days ago, didn't say where she was going. Zara had set up an appointment for us with an independent doctor named Jay Smoothbay, who worked at a clinic across town. He spent 3 hours going through Abigail's medical records, frowning deeper with each page. He pointed out 4 different medications Renee had given Abigail that weren't standard protocol. One of them, he said, could cause exactly the kind of complications that would require emergency surgery. Another one wasn't even supposed to be used during labor at all. He wrote everything down in a detailed report for us. I couldn't stop thinking about confronting Renee directly, so I looked up her address through public records. It took me 2 days of searching property records at the courthouse, but I finally found her house in a nice suburb 40 minutes away. I parked down the street the next morning, watching her house and waiting for her to come out. But before I could even get out of my car, someone knocked on my window. A process server handed me legal papers through the window. It was a cease and desist order requiring me to stay 500 feet away from Renee at all times. She must have seen me on her security cameras. The order included her home, her work, and anywhere else she might be. Violating it would mean immediate arrest. Through Zara's contacts, I got an unofficial meeting with Khadijah Deepshire from State Social Services. We met at a coffee shop near the courthouse where she explained she couldn't open an official investigation without a formal complaint. But she told me how private adoptions could work when birth parents were vulnerable or sedated. She'd seen cases where paperwork was signed while mothers were still under anesthesia, where fathers were told their wives had agreed when they hadn't. She gave me a list of red flags to look for in adoption documents. The stress was affecting everything in my life. My boss called me into his office on a Friday afternoon, closing the door behind me. He said I'd missed too many days, and when I was there, I wasn't focused. He'd noticed me making calls during work hours and leaving early without explanation. He gave me an official warning letter that said my job was at risk if things didn't improve immediately. I hadn't told him anything about what was happening because I could barely believe it myself. That same night when I got home from work, I found a manila envelope shoved under our apartment door with no return address or postage. Inside were photocopied shift schedules from the hospital going back 5 years. Every single night that a baby died during an emergency C-section, Renee had been working. There were 17 cases total, but what made my hands shake was the second document in the envelope. It was a death certificate for our daughter with all the information filled out, dated and time-stamped 2 hours before she was even born. Someone had prepared the paperwork before the emergency C-section even happened. I called Zara immediately, and she came over within an hour to look at the documents. She took photos of everything and said we needed to file an emergency motion right away to preserve any biological samples or remains from our daughter. The next morning, she was at the courthouse when it opened. The judge granted the preservation order, but Zara warned me not to get my hopes up since 3 weeks had already passed. 2 days later, the hospital's lawyer sent a response that made me punch a hole in our kitchen wall. They claimed the baby had been cremated after 72 hours per their policy for unclaimed remains. According to them, we never formally requested the body, which was a complete lie, but I had no way to prove it. They said they'd followed standard procedure and all the paperwork was in order. Meanwhile, Mustafa had been digging through public records and adoption filings. He called me with news that made everything click into place. Renee had been the notary on over 40 private adoptions in the past 5 years. Every single one followed the same pattern: emergency C-section, immediate infant death, and then a private adoption finalized within days with the same adoption agency. The amounts paid for medical expenses ranged from $50,000 to $100,000. He'd mapped out the dates, and they matched perfectly with the shift schedules from the envelope. The FOIA request I'd filed weeks earlier finally came back, but it was almost useless. Page after page was blacked out with thick marker. The only thing visible was a note about a spike in adverse events in the maternity ward over the past 5 years. Everything else was redacted for patient privacy. They'd even blacked out the total number of incidents. I started noticing a dark blue sedan everywhere I went. It would be parked across from our apartment in the morning, then somehow at the grocery store when I stopped for milk. When I tried to walk toward it to get the license license plate, it would speed away before I could get close. After 3 days of this, I was checking my mirrors constantly and taking different routes home. The paranoia was eating at me, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Then my phone buzzed with a message from an app I didn't recognize. Someone named Ibrahim said he worked in the hospital's IT department and had seen suspicious activity in their electronic health record system. He was scared but willing to help if I could guarantee his name wouldn't come out. We arranged to meet at a park across town where he showed me printouts of audit logs from the hospital's computer system. Someone had accessed our daughter's medical records 3 days after her death and modified them. Timestamps had been changed, notes had been added that weren't there originally, and vital signs had been altered. Ibrahim had the original cached versions showing what the records looked like before the changes. He said this kind of tampering happened with other cases too, but he couldn't testify openly because he'd lose his job and probably face criminal charges for accessing the records without authorization. Zara looked at the evidence and explained the legal problem we faced. The audit logs were powerful evidence, but without Ibrahim authenticating them in court, they'd be considered hearsay and thrown out. She tried to convince him to sign an affidavit at least, but he was shaking his head before she even finished talking. He had 2 kids and couldn't risk his job or going to jail. What's making Renee notarize over 40 adoptions that all follow this exact same pattern? The emergency C-sections, immediate deaths, then quick private adoptions with huge medical expense payments. That's quite a specific sequence happening over and over again with her involved each time. Zara said she understood and would give him time to think about it, but I could tell from her face she didn't think he'd change his mind. The stress was destroying my marriage. Abigail barely spoke to me anymore, and we were sleeping in separate rooms. She blamed me for not being in the delivery room, for not fighting harder to stop them from taking her away for the C-section. I blamed myself too. We finally agreed to try couples therapy to deal with everything. The therapist kept steering the conversation toward grief and loss, talking about the stages of acceptance. But how could we grieve when we believed our daughter was alive somewhere? How could we process a loss that we didn't think was real? Abigail broke down crying, saying she could still feel our baby out there, that a mother knows these things. The therapist just nodded and wrote notes about trauma-induced delusions. After that first session, we sat in the car in silence for 20 minutes before Abigail finally spoke. She said she couldn't keep living like this, investigating and searching. Either we'd find proof soon, or she needed to try to move on somehow. I didn't know what to say because I couldn't imagine giving up, but I also couldn't stand seeing her fall apart more each day. The envelope under our door had given us more evidence, but we were still hitting walls everywhere we turned. 3 days later, a process server knocked on our door with papers from the hospital, claiming we were making threats and harassing their staff, and they wanted a restraining order against both of us. The hearing was set for the following week, and my hands shook as I read through their claims that we'd been stalking nurses and making the workplace unsafe. I called Zara right away, and she said she'd represent us at the hearing, but warned me that judges usually sided with hospitals in these cases. That whole week, I couldn't sleep thinking about how they were trying to silence us legally now. When the hearing day came, we sat in the small courtroom while the hospital's lawyer painted us as crazy parents who couldn't accept our loss and were now terrorizing innocent medical workers. The judge listened to both sides and then did something unexpected by setting mutual boundaries where we couldn't contact hospital staff directly, but the hospital had to preserve all records related to our case for potential future legal action. It wasn't much, but Zara said getting the preservation order was actually a small win, since hospitals sometimes destroyed records after a certain time. 2 weeks after the hearing, Mustafa called to say his article about suspicious patterns at the hospital was going live the next morning, and he'd kept our names out of it, but highlighted all the adoption irregularities he'd found. When the article went up online, the hospital immediately issued a statement calling it baseless conspiracy theories and threatening legal action against the newspaper. The comments section exploded with people arguing about whether we were grief-stricken parents unable to accept reality or victims of something bigger. Some people shared their own weird experiences at the same hospital, while others called us dangerous conspiracy theorists who needed mental help. The social media fights got so bad I had to stop reading them because seeing strangers debate whether our baby was really dead made me physically sick. Around this time, I tried calling Kelly to see if she'd talk to us again, but her phone was disconnected, and when I drove by her apartment, the neighbor said she'd moved out suddenly one night with just a couple suitcases looking scared. Her social media accounts were all deleted, and it was like she'd just vanished completely, which made me even more sure she knew something important. Na called me quietly from her personal phone one evening to point out something she'd noticed while reviewing adoption records for her job. One adoption from our hospital had first been filed in a different county, then transferred back, which she said looked like someone trying to hide the paper trail, though she couldn't say more without risking her job. Meanwhile, Jay had gotten her anesthesiologist friend to look at the surgery notes off the record, and the friend said several standard consent forms were missing, and the anesthesia dose listed was weird for a routine C-section. She wouldn't put anything in writing, but told Jay it looked like corners were cut or records were altered after after the fact. Then one morning, we got a voicemail from a blocked number with a distorted voice saying if we didn't stop our crusade, they'd call Child Protective Services about our mental instability and make sure we could never adopt or have another child. When Abigail heard it, she completely broke down sobbing about how they could take away our chance to ever be parents again, and I held her while she shook with fear. The threat worked because she was too scared to do anything public for weeks after that. But then, Mustafa's article started getting attention from the state health department, and they announced they'd be opening a preliminary review of the hospital's practices and would take sworn statements from affected families over the next month. This gave us some hope, even though we knew government investigations moved slowly and hospitals had ways of covering things up. Ibrahim had been avoiding our calls, but finally reached out through his lawyer saying he'd provide a sealed affidavit about the altered medical records he'd seen, but only with complete legal protection and anonymity guaranteed. Zara spent days working with his lawyer to draft something that would protect Ibrahim while still helping our case, and finally got him to sign a statement about specific discrepancies he'd witnessed in our file and others. Zara took that affidavit straight to court the next morning and filed a motion to compel discovery. She said Ibrahim's statement proved the hospital was hiding something and we needed access to all the records they'd been blocking. The hospital's lawyers showed up within hours with their response. They called the affidavit hearsay since Ibrahim wouldn't testify in person and said a sealed statement from an anonymous source wasn't enough to force them to hand over anything. The judge said he'd think about it and get back to us in a week. Meanwhile, Mustafa had been working his own angle through someone he knew who worked security at the hospital's parking garage. This guy owed Mustafa a favor from years back and agreed to pull the footage from the morning after our daughter supposedly died. What he found made my stomach turn. The timestamp showed 6:47 a.m., right when Renee clocked out according to the records we already had. The grainy footage showed her walking out the staff exit carrying something covered with a blanket. When she turned to open her car door, you could see the edge of an infant car seat underneath. Mustafa's friend burned the footage to a disk and gave us the original file too. We took it straight to the police station that same afternoon. This time we didn't get brushed off at the front desk. A detective named Rodriguez actually came out to meet us and took us to an interview room. He watched the footage 3 times, looked at all our documents, and asked detailed questions for over 2 hours. He said with Ibrahim's affidavit about the altered records and now this video evidence, he could open a preliminary investigation. He gave us a case number and everything, but warned us these things moved slow and not to expect quick results. 2 days later, my phone started blowing up with messages. Someone had posted on the hospital's Facebook page that Ibrahim was under investigation for accessing patient files without authorization. The post said he'd been placed on administrative leave pending a full review. I tried calling him, but his number was disconnected. Zara heard through her contacts that the hospital had somehow figured out he was our source, even though we'd kept everything anonymous. They were making an example of him to scare off anyone else who might want to help us. That night, Abigail brought up something we'd been avoiding. She wanted to go fully public with our real names and faces to put more pressure on the investigation. We'd been using fake names online to protect ourselves, but she thought maybe it was time to stop hiding. I understood her frustration, but worried about what would happen if we became the story instead of what the hospital did. We went back and forth for hours about whether the extra attention would help or just make us targets. We decided to wait until after the judge ruled on our discovery motion. That ruling came down 3 days later. The judge granted us limited access to financial records related to adoption fees and payments from the past 5 years, but he refused to unseal any adoptive parents' identities, saying their privacy rights outweighed our claims without more concrete proof. Zara said it was better than nothing and immediately sent the hospital a demand for the financial documents. They had 30 days to comply. When those records finally arrived, Zara spent a whole weekend going through them with an accountant she'd brought in. They found something buried in the paperwork that made everything click. The hospital had been paying consulting fees to Renee through something called the Family Foundation Services. This shell organization processed adoption payments and kicked back $5,000 to Renee for every adoption she notarized. Over 3 years, she'd notarized 47 adoptions and collected almost $250,000. The foundation's address was a P.O. box, but the corporate filing listed Granlock's wife as the treasurer. Sunday morning at church, Abigail grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. She nodded toward a couple 3 rows ahead of us with a newborn. The woman was holding the baby, and when she turned to pass her to her husband, we both saw the baby's face. The hospital paying Renee through a shell company with Granlock's wife as treasurer makes me really curious about the money trail here. $250,000 for notarizing forms seems like way more than just paperwork fees to me. The nose, the chin, even the way the baby's hair grew in a little swirl at the crown looked exactly like Abigail's nephew did as a newborn. Abigail started to stand up, but I pulled her back down. After service, we sat in our car watching them load the baby into their minivan. They looked so happy, so normal, just parents loving their new baby. We followed them for a few blocks before I pulled over. We sat there for an hour talking about what to do. These people probably thought they'd adopted legally and had no idea about what the hospital did. If we approached them, we'd destroy their whole world. They might even be victims too, paying huge fees thinking they were helping with medical costs. But knowing our daughter might be right there, just a few blocks away, and doing nothing felt like swallowing broken glass. Every instinct screamed to go knock on their door, but we knew it could ruin any legal case we had and destroy innocent lives. We drove home in silence and didn't talk about it for 2 days. That's when we got a call from Granlock's assistant saying the hospital wanted to meet about a new settlement offer. We showed up with Zara to find Granlock and 3 lawyers waiting. They pushed a paper across the table with a number that made me blink. $200,000, and all we had to do was sign an NDA and drop everything. Our savings were gone from legal fees and Zara's retainer. The credit cards were maxed out, and we'd already borrowed from Abigail's parents. That money could fix everything financially and let us try for another baby, but it would also mean letting them get away with stealing our daughter, and who knows how many others. I looked at Abigail, and she looked at me, and we both knew what we had to do. We pushed the paper back across the table unsigned. The hospital lawyer's face went red, and he started talking about how we'd regret this, but we were already walking out. That night, Zara called and said she'd been thinking about our case and would cut her fees in half because she believed something big was happening here. The next week, we sat in a sterile government office while state health department investigators asked us the same questions we'd answered 100 times before, but this time was different because halfway through our interview, the door opened and 3 other couples walked in. They all had the same story about babies dying at our hospital and bodies that didn't look right. The lead investigator, a woman named Khadija, took over the case personally, but warned us this could take years to resolve. 2 days later, Mustafa's follow-up article hit the front page with direct quotes from Ibrahim's sworn statement about the altered medical records. By noon, the hospital's stock had dropped 12%, and they announced an internal investigation to address what they called unfounded allegations. The next morning, Renee didn't show up for her shift, and word spread that she was on administrative leave pending the investigation. That same afternoon, Mr. Granlock sent out an email saying he'd decided to retire early to spend more time with his grandchildren, though everyone knew the timing wasn't a coincidence. The police finally got their warrant, but it was narrow, only covering specific notary logs and financial transactions from the past 2 years. It wasn't everything we needed, but it was more than we'd had before. That night, Abigail and I sat on the floor of what should have been our daughter's nursery, holding each other while boxes of evidence surrounded us. We were learning that some fights don't have clean endings, just the slow grind of paperwork and waiting. A week later, we saw Renee at the courthouse where she was giving her deposition. She walked right past us like we were invisible, but I saw her hands shaking as she signed in at the security desk. 3 months after they took our daughter, I couldn't stand the silence anymore and wrote everything out in a Facebook post. Within hours, my inbox was flooded with hundreds of messages from parents across the country who had similar suspicions about their own losses. The district attorney's office called the next day to say they were officially reviewing our case for criminal charges. They assigned a prosecutor who specialized in complex medical fraud, but made it clear that proving intent would be nearly impossible. Ibrahim called me that weekend to say he'd reached a settlement with the hospital that included full whistleblower protections and 18 months of back pay. He was already packing to move to another state where nobody would know his name or what he'd done. The investigation kept grinding forward with depositions and document reviews and court hearings that all blurred together. More families joined our group, and Mustafa kept publishing articles that the hospital kept denying. Zara filed motion after motion while the hospital's lawyers tried to bury us in paperwork. The state health department expanded their investigation to 5 years of records. The FBI got involved when they found interstate adoption connections. Local news picked up the story, and suddenly our faces were on TV every night. Support groups formed online, and vigils were held outside the hospital. Board members started resigning, and donors pulled their funding. The hospital's accreditation came under review, but none of it brought our daughter back, and none of it told us where she was. We hired a private investigator who traced adoption records to 3 different states. We contacted every family lawyer who would listen. We spent our nights going through thousands of pages of documents, looking for the one piece of evidence that would crack everything open. Abigail started therapy for the nightmares, and I started drinking too much coffee to stay awake for all the late-night research sessions. Our marriage bent under the weight, but didn't break. We learned which reporters would tell our story fairly, and which ones just wanted drama. We learned how to read medical records and legal documents. We learned that justice moves slowly when it moves at all. The other families became our support system, sharing leads and documents, and sometimes just listening when one of us needed to scream. Some days we made progress, and some days we hit dead ends. The hospital kept operating and babies kept being born there because nobody could prove anything definitively yet. But the pressure was building, and cracks were starting to show. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 2 in the morning, and when I answered, a woman whispered that she had information about other babies at the hospital, but needed protection first. I recognized Kelly's voice immediately and told her I'd meet her anywhere she wanted. She gave me an address for a parking garage downtown, and when I got there, she was sitting in her car with the engine running. She handed me a folder full of death certificates and adoption papers with matching dates and told me 7 other families had lost babies the same way we did. She said the prosecutor needed to promise her immunity before she'd testify because she'd signed some of those papers herself under pressure from Renee. I called the prosecutor's office right there from the parking garage and left a message saying we had a witness who could prove pattern behavior. The next morning, the prosecutor called back and said they'd consider immunity if Kelly's information checked out. I drove the folder to their office myself and watched them compare dates and signatures for 2 hours. The state medical board got involved that same week after we filed complaints about Morrison's quick diagnoses. 6 other families joined our complaint saying he'd medicated them within minutes of them questioning their babies' deaths. The board opened a formal investigation and started pulling Morrison's files going back 5 years. They found he'd prescribed antipsychotics to grieving parents 17 times, and always after they'd questioned hospital procedures. Meanwhile, Abigail started seeing a new doctor who helped her slowly reduce the medication Morrison had forced on her. Every week she took a little less, and every week she seemed more like herself again. The grief hit harder without the drugs numbing everything, but at least we could face it together instead of her being trapped in that chemical fog. We held each other through the worst nights when the pain felt like it would break us both. The FBI showed up at our door 6 weeks into the investigation with badges and serious faces. They said the adoption patterns suggested interstate trafficking, and they needed every document we had. We sat at our kitchen table for 6 hours while they photographed papers and took notes about every conversation we'd had with hospital staff. They asked about the money trail and the adoption agency and whether we'd noticed any out-of-state families at the hospital. They took our entire file box and gave us a receipt with a case number. 2 days later, they arrested Renee at the hospital during her shift. The news showed her being walked out in handcuffs while other nurses watched from the windows. The charges were fraud and conspiracy, but not kidnapping since they couldn't prove our daughter hadn't died. She posted bail that same afternoon, and her lawyer went on TV saying she was being made a scapegoat for hospital administration failures. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks later in a packed courtroom. We sat in the second row and watched Renee walk in wearing a suit instead of scrubs. Behind us in the gallery sat a woman who looked just like Renee but younger, and when our eyes met, she looked away quickly. During a break, I heard someone call her Renee's daughter and saw her wiping tears from her face. She kept looking at us with this expression that made me think she knew something about what her mother had done. The prosecutor presented adoption papers and bank records and testimony from Kelly about the pattern of suspicious deaths. Kelly handing over death certificates and adoption papers with matching dates makes me wonder what exactly pushed her to finally come forward now after being part of this system for who knows how long. Renee's lawyer argued everything was circumstantial and his client had followed hospital protocol. The judge listened to 3 days of arguments before making her decision. She ruled there was enough evidence for the case to go to trial on fraud and conspiracy charges. It wasn't the murder or kidnapping charges we wanted, but it was more than we'd had 3 months ago when everyone called us crazy for questioning our daughter's death. The trial date was set for 4 months out, and Renee would stay free on bail until then. We walked out of the courthouse into bright sunlight and reporters asking for comments. We didn't know where our daughter was, or even if she was still alive somewhere. The FBI said they were tracking adoption records in 3 states, but couldn't make any promises about finding her. Some days, just knowing we'd exposed this system felt like victory, and we'd imagine her safe with some family who had no idea she was stolen. Other days, the not knowing felt like drowning in place while everyone else moved forward with their lives. But we kept fighting because stopping would mean accepting she was really gone forever, and we couldn't do that. We met with lawyers and investigators and other families who'd lost babies at that hospital. We learned that Renee had worked there for 15 years, and the suspicious deaths had started 7 years ago. We learned that the hospital had made over $2 million from adoption fees during that time. We learned that at least 12 families had stories like ours, but most had been too medicated or threatened to fight back. Every piece of information made the picture clearer, but didn't bring our daughter any closer to coming home. Man, thanks for hanging out with me and wondering through all these twists and turns today. It's been a wild ride to share with you all. Catch you in the next one. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.